Hello class. This video is a continuation of discussing how survey, mapping, and surface collection helped answer some questions at the archaeological site of Dine Su in Oaxaca, Mexico. So in the last video, I was just starting to talk about the importance of the ritual landscape. Well, one of our archaeological questions was to get a better feel for this. It seems that Dainzú was actually one of the religious centers during the Classic period, which is the time period in which Montalban was the capital of essentially a Zapotec empire, which controlled the entire valley. The ritual landscape is no coincidence. The people who founded the site some 2,000 years ago, or even earlier, really 2,500 years ago, they first built in this region around Cerro Dainzú. So you can see Cerro Dainzú is in the south, Cerro Danush is in the north. I'll get to Danush later. Cerro Dainzú, this area in the south, the very first settlement at the archaeological site altogether dates to this region, and it dates to about 700 BCE, so about 2,700 years ago. So what's going on in that region? Well, first, some rescue excavations had occurred in the 1970s and 80s, run by a very famous Mexican archaeologist known as Ignacio Bernal. He became the head archaeologist of all of Mexico at one point. In any case, Ignacio Bernal and another well-known Mexican archaeologist, Arturo Oliveros, they excavated as a salvage project some of the site of Dainzú, just a tiny little portion of it, maybe about 1% of the site. And they uncovered a temple and a ball court and a couple of other temples and maybe a palace, we're not really sure. They didn't publish a lot on the work they did here. They just did it to open it up as a park, and they were going to have a museum there. The museum never got built, but the park is still open today. So if you travel to Oaxaca, you can go to Dainzú and walk around these ruins. Okay, this is our map, our three-dimensional image of those same ruins. So you can see there's a large pyramidal platform here with a staircase and a large wall here. There's a bunch of structures down here, and here's an eye-shaped ball court. I talked a little bit before about the Mesoamerican ball game. It was a ball game, at least in Aztec times, where they played with a rubber ball and they weren't allowed to touch it with their hands. And it's kind of a mix of soccer and basketball in that they had to try to get the ball through a hoop without touching it with their hands. So kind of a fascinating thing. The only ball court that we've identified in our mapping at all at Dainzú is this one right here that was excavated by Ignacio Bernal and Arturo Oliveros. So what are some of the things that they uncovered there in their excavations? Well, they found that although the ball cart has the same shape as the types of ball carts that were played with in later times, what they found were these carved images. So what are they called again? Petroglyphs. These carved images on the wall of that temple where individuals were wearing helmets and protective gear, but they were holding round balls in their hands. And it seemed like these round balls are actually not rubber, but stone. And in fact, they were whipping them at each other and knocking each other over. So very different from what we know from the later period. So some different type of ball game going on at Dainzú. Some other really wonderful imagery at Dainzú. This is a tomb front, so a facade of a tomb. This is the tomb in here that's found at Dainzú. And as you can see, it also has petroglyphs carved into it. And this is the head of a jaguar and the paws. You can see the front shoulder here and the paw coming down with the claws there. And so this is an image of a jaguar. And there's lots of jaguar imagery all over the place, including several of the petroglyphs showing individuals dressed in jaguar coats. So in other words, they killed a jaguar, cut it, and then wore the coats over their skin to signify their connection to jaguars. Nothing really connects the family that was buried in this tomb more to jaguars than this image right here. And just to back up, Jaguars in Mesoamerica are extremely important figures. And in very early times, it seems like jaguars were connected to royal ancestral lines. So, for instance, the king and the queen would say that somewhere in their ancestry, a jaguar mated with a human to create their ancestral line, and this is why they have the right to rule. And so they tracked ancestral lines very carefully, and this image sort of reinforces that, right? The family that comes from the jaguar. Pretty cool. So expanding out a little bit, this is the map of the mountain that we made and the structures that are on top of it. So you can see there is like on the summit of Cerro Danush, there is a square patio with two temples right next to it. And so this temple patio precinct, also you saw that in other places, right? Every single neighborhood had its temple patio precinct. Careful inspection, however, showed that the ball court and these two temples with their patio between them had the same exact orientation as this temple patio complex at the summit of the mountain. Every other structure here is angled a little bit differently. We're not really sure what that angle is, but these are essentially oriented to 15 degrees east of north in this direction, both of them. And everything else is about 10 degrees east of north. And this is actually 25 degrees east of north, which I'll talk about in a moment. But since these were all clearly intentionally made at the same angle, but not only that, there is a path. So this is a contemporary road. It's actually an ox cart road. It's how you get to the Dine Su archaeological zone if you're visiting and you're driving. But the pavement stops somewhere around here, and then it becomes an ox cart path. And so people bring their oxes and their goats and their sheep and all kinds of things up and down this path when they're bringing them out to the fields out here to chomp. Anyway, there is an ancient path that leads up right above here, and it keeps going and zigzags all the way up to the summit of the mountain. And along that path, there's a cliff face, and in that cliff face, there are several petroglyphs of ball players, so these helmeted individuals. And so here's the ball court with two temples, oriented the same way as the summit up top, and most likely this connection shows that there was some kind of pilgrimage that was part of a ball game ritual. So maybe they played the ball game or something like that here, and then they would go up the side of the mountain, and I'm sorry, this is actually the path, and zigzags up here and brings them up to the summit of the mountain where they took part in some other type of ritual ceremony. We still have to conduct excavations to learn more about what's going on here, but clearly the ball game centers here and here, and the Jaguar iconography and the ball players all help us learn a little bit about this. So today, in some places in Mesoamerica, communities have a celebration of tigers. And tigers are sometimes what people call jaguars. When the Spaniards first came to Mesoamerica, they had never seen a jaguar before, so they just called them tigers. And so in some places, the word tiger substitutes for the word jaguar. Obviously, there were no tigers in Mesoamerica. Jaguars are really cool, though, and they're tiger-like, but they're not. They're jaguars. In any case, some of that imagery that I talked about, the ball players and such, well, there's a little bit more to it than that. First of all, ball courts in Mesoamerica are considered conduits to contact with the underworld. So the place where people go after they die, the underworld. And one way to communicate with people in the underworld is to play the ball game in this suspended court in a low portion of the site. And jaguar was, because it's a nocturnal creature, jaguars hunt at night. Jaguars are associated with the underworld, and in early Zapotec times, it is likely that the lord or deity of the underworld was the jaguar. And there's all kinds of jaguar imagery associated with the underworld. Owls, another nocturnal animal, are also associated with the underworld, but they have a different role. They're considered to bring messages from the land of the dead to the land of the living. So when they record their songs and things like that, they're conveying messages from the land of the dead. It's pretty fascinating. In any case, so we have this ball cart at the base of the mountain where the ball game is played at one of the lowest portions at the base of the mountain, and then some type of ceremony takes place up at the top. Today, contemporary societies, indigenous societies in Mexico, they practice a dance of the tigers where there is a mock battle that happens between tigers and humans in a lower area of the site. And then they all together make a pilgrimage to one of the high parts of the site and leave offerings and have dances and things like that. And so that may be a contemporary version of what may have happened here at Cerro Dine Su in the past. However, we need more excavation and information to sort of support that hypothesis. The last thing I wanted to talk about was this grouping over here. Here you have a patio, a flat patio with 4 temple mounds surrounding it. This structure, this compound, it was built after all this stuff. This compound was actually built somewhere around 600 AD, so almost 1,000 years after these structures were built. This was also built in a time when the site was expanding. So this is the original site center. Starting at about 700 BCE. These structures were built a little bit later than that, but all surrounding them, all these terraces are all where the commoner people lived, and all surrounding that is where they had their farms to support the community. Well, around 5 to 600 AD, the site expanded and almost tripled in size over a 100-year period and became a lot more occupied. The population went way up and many structures were built. In fact, the overall large site map, most of those structures are from this time period. So everything in this area around Dine Su is from the earliest period up until the late period. So it was still occupied in that later period. But then everything else at the site was built in this 500 to 600 AD range, including this structure here, which has a completely different orientation than everything else here. In fact, it has the same orientation as the summit structure on Cerro d'Anush. So this is that, remember, this is that 3D image that I made of the summit of Cerro d'Anush. And here is that orientation. Here's that 25 degrees east of north orientation. Cool thing about this orientation is that this line leads to the sunrise of the sun on the winter solstice. And if you look out in this direction, it correlates to the sunset of the sun on the summer solstice. So that's pretty interesting. And this leads me into talking about the overall site orientation, which if you take that patio, so here's Cerro Dine Su, here's that small structure that I was talking about, that 4 pyramidal mound. Well, if you take the center of that patio and you line it up with the center of the patio that's at the summit of Cerro d'Anush, take a look at this. This is a perfect straight line that connects the two. Isn't that fascinating? Think about the planning that had to go into that. This right here is the Pan American Highway. See that? It's almost perpendicular. It is also in this same orientation. All of the structures in the field, all the structures on Cerro d'Anush, all oriented the same orientation. In fact, contemporary walls and things like that are built to this same orientation. This is a soccer field that we mapped during the project that people still use to play soccer games. And it is oriented, as you can see, to this same orientation. And this orientation has to do with the winter solstice sunrise and the summer solstice sunset. In the next video, I'll get into a little bit more of what we learned.